All right, it's one last midnight. Welcome back to another lesson in programming in C#, a beginner's course. Now, if you haven't already, make sure that you go back and watch the previous lessons. In the last lesson, we covered conditional statements, also known as selection statement. And we're going to continue to keep building on our knowledge with our little trivia program. At the end of the lesson, I asked you to do a challenge, which was to see if you could try to reproduce my starting screen with some ASCII art or changing of some colors. And also to see if you can ask some questions of the user, like what is their name and what is their player house, since we're doing a Harry Potter trivia game. And let's go ahead and look at what I did for the challenge. Now, I created a new region. We learned about regions in the last lesson, and that's to keep your code organized. I called it player setup, and I wound up creating several new variables. Now, I'm not currently using player score or player rank, but I am using the first three. I changed my foreground color to white because previously it was a different color for the title screen. And I also changed my cursor visibility to true. That way you can see the cursor blink inside of the application. I wound up asking what the player name is, and I waited for a response to come back. And then with our conditional statements, I evaluated to make sure that the string was not empty. If it was empty, I put in a line that said, please enter the player name. There's currently no way to trap and force the user to answer this question. We're actually going to solve this problem with the looping statements that we'll wind up learning today. And then I went on to ask about whether they were a witch or a wizard. Essentially, this is my gender question. And I wound up using a switch statement to evaluate that value and then turn around and put the appropriate male or female value into that variable. And then lastly, I asked what their school was and allowed them select between one of four values and store that into the appropriate player house variable. So let's run the application and you'll see what happens. All right, the application starts up. We have our logo, we have our title. We saw this before. We have the title of the application, the game. We have Harry Potter edition, some copyright information, a little description, and then we go into the question. So player name, I do midnight, and then what? Am I a witch or a wizard? This is my gender question. I'm going to say 2, I'm a wizard. And then it asks me what my house is, and I have one of 4 answers I can choose from. And then once I do that, the game is pretty much over. There's no more code after this point. So if I hit any key on the keyboard, the application will end. And you notice that the cursor is sitting there blinking, which it didn't do before. So now we have an indicator of where our position is. And if I was to hit any key on the keyboard, the application would close down and we'd be back in Visual Studio. And there we are. And so that's what I did for my challenge. Today's lesson, we're going to focus on looping statements, also known as iteration statements. So let's go ahead and get into it. In this lesson, we're going to cover some topics. We're going to look at the do statement, the while statement, the for statement, the FOREACH statement, and then also we're going to look at some jump statements. We're going to do a little bit of a recap and then another challenge at the end of this lesson. The do statement, also known as the do while statement, will execute a statement or statements while an expression is true. And you can also exit out of the do loop using a jump statement such as break, go to, return, or throw. And we'll look at jump statements towards the end of this lesson. The code for a do statement is pretty straightforward and simple. It starts off with do, and your execute statements are surrounded with brackets. At the end of the do statement, you'll put a while, and inside of parentheses, some expression that equals true. So let's look at this from a more practical stance with a little bit of an example. I just want to focus on the do statement. So I'm going to take all of my previous code and I created a new region called old stuff. And I'm just going to highlight my other previous regions and comment them out. And this way I won't have to worry about any of this other code executing. It is just going to execute our new code that we're going to write. And that way we can focus on the lessons that we're going to learn today more directly. So let's look into the do statement. Again, the do statement is pretty simple to write. We start with do and enter in a bracket. At the end of the do statement, we're going to put in a while statement. And that while statement is going to have some sort of condition. Now, I don't have a condition right now, but just hold on a second. Let's spin up an integer and we'll just call it n, and we'll make that variable equal to 0. I want this loop to continue to run while n is less than 5. So I'm going to put in an expression, n is less than 5. So we need to execute some sort of statements inside of the do loop. Those are going to be console.writeLine, and I want to print out the value of n. And then what I want to do also is I want to increment n. I want n to go up. And so the two pluses next to n tell n to increment. So it's going to start at 0, and when it hits this line, it's going to increment by 1, so the value of n will be 1. And this loop is going to continue while n is less than 5. So let's go ahead and run this code. So you'll see that it printed out 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the application stopped at that point in time. The do loop exited because the statement was no longer true. So just a recap on the do loop. It is very simple concept. While this expression equals to true, this block of code will continue to run. That is how the do loop works. Let's move on to the while statement. Now the while statement is very similar to the do statement. It executes statements while a Boolean expression is true, and you can exit the loop by using a jump statement like you could in the do loop. Now the syntax is a little bit different. You're going to type in while, and in parens, you're going to put in your expression that evaluates to true. And then in between the brackets of the while statement, you're going to have your execute statements. Let's go ahead and look at this in code. Let's comment out the do code that we wrote, and let's write the while code. We're going to have the same variable n, and we're going to make that equal to 0. And we're going to start writing the while code. So we type in while, we start parens, and we put in our condition, n is less than 5. And then we're going to put in a bracket. Now inside of the bracket, we're actually going to take this exact same code that we had in the do loop, and we're just going to uncomment it out. And we're going to say, hey, write to the console the value of n, and then increment n. We're going to add one number to n. And let's go ahead and run this code. And we're going to get the exact same result that we did in the do statement. It's going to print out 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's because the condition is the same, and it's actually pretty much doing exactly the same code as the do statement did. So it's going to go into the while statement, and it's going to loop and loop and loop until this condition is no longer true. When it gets to actually 5, it is no longer less than 5, and it'll jump out of the loop. That is the while statement. All right, now you're probably thinking to yourself, why have the do and the while loops? Why not just have one? What's the purpose of having both of those? Because they pretty much do the same thing. Well, technically they don't. So if you look at the do while loop, the do while loop will execute one or more times. Always one or more times. And the while loop will execute 0 or more times. Now that probably confused you even more. So let's go look at the code. Okay, here we have our do and our while loops. Let's make just a quick adjustment. Let's go ahead and uncomment this out. Let's uncomment out the variable. Let's get rid of the variable here by commenting it out. And let's set the value just be equal to 0. And we're also going to change the conditions. Let's take the condition here to 0, and let's take the condition here to 0. Now the while loop is automatically going to evaluate, and it's going to get there and it's going to say, hey, look, you're not less than 0. So it's automatically going to jump out of the loop. Let's go ahead and look at this. And the result we get back is what I expected. The do loop, because it went into this particular statement one time, it printed out 0. And then it evaluated and found out that this statement was no longer true anymore, so it exited out of the do loop. The while loop, it evaluates in the beginning, so it never even got to this particular block of statements, and it just exited out immediately. That's the difference between the do and the while loop. Let's move on to the for statement. Now the for statement is built up of 3 parts. It has an initializer, it has a condition, and it has the iterator. The iterator is very similar to what we did in the do and the while loop, where we're iterating one number up. It executes statements while the expression or the condition is true, and you can exit out of it again using jump statements. Now the syntax is slightly different. So you're going to type in for, and in the parentheses, you're going to wind up putting in the 3 sections that it requires. It's going to require the initializer. In this case, it's an integer that we called x, which is equal to 0. And the condition, just like the do and the while loops, is this is going to run while x is less than 5. And the iterator is incrementing our initializer. And then it's going to execute statements inside of the brackets. So let's go ahead and look at this in code. All right, back in Visual Studio, let's go ahead and comment out our do and while loops. And let's write our for loop. Now we're going to type in for, we're going to put in our brackets, we're going to say int, and we'll use n instead of x. Int equals 0, we're going to put in a semicolon. And then we're going to say n is less than 5. And then we're going to put in a semicolon, and we're going to say n plus plus. This is our iteration. And we're going to put in our brackets, and we're done. And we're going to put out the console write line again for n. And what I expect this to do, just like the do in the while loops, is it'll run through this block of code while this condition is true. Once this condition becomes false, it equals 5 or more, then it will wind up dropping out of the loop. And let's go ahead and take a look at this. The application starts up and it prints out 0 through 4. And that's exactly what the code says. Start from 0, continue while you are less than 5, and on every iteration, increment this n number by 1. And then once you exceed that, drop out of the loop. Let's move on to the for each statement. So the for each statement is slightly different than when we looked at in the last loops. The for each statement actually executes statements based off of an element in some sort of collection, or think of it as a list, like a grocery list, and you're checking items off. It'll go through and iterate through each one of those. And you can exit out of this loop again by using jump statements to get out of it. Let's go ahead and look at the syntax now. The syntax is kind of similar to the for statement, where your items in which you are looping through are inside of the parens, and then your execute statements are inside of the brackets. In this case, numbers represents the list, and the I, the integer I, represents that specific item that you're iterating through at this particular moment in time. Okay, we're back in Visual Studio, and I have a block of code already pre-prepared for you. Now, this first line is an array, and I don't want to get too much into arrays. Just think of it as a list. It's a collection of items. We will get into arrays in 2 lessons from now. Now, the for each statement says, in this collection of items, numbers, in my list, for each single one of these elements, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, I'm going to loop through each one of them. And I'm going to put that value into the integer I. And so if I was to run this block of code, what would you expect to get? Well, I expect to get 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 printed out. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. And I get exactly what I expect, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 printed out sequentially. Because that's what the code says. It says go through each one of the elements in this list, in this collection, and print out the value. And that is the for each statement. So just put this concept on a shelf for now. We'll get back to it. Okay, we've heard a lot about jump statements, and jump statements allow you to break out of the looping statements. It also allows you to break out of the conditional statements as well. You'll notice that break was already used while we were looking at the switch statement. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one of these. We will address these as we use them throughout this little project and throughout the basic training course. Like I said, we've already used break to get out of the switch statements. Return and throw we'll wind up using pretty extensively towards the later half when we get into methods and we get into error handling. And then we'll see if we wind up using condition or go to. I might briefly touch on it if we don't use it throughout the project. All right, so we're on to the recap. So what are looping statements? I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, but see if you can come up with the answer. And then what are the 3 parts of the for statement? Remember I said the for statement had 3 specific parts. Also, the for each statement, what is it actually looping through? Do you remember? And then finally, what do jump statements actually do? I mean, they do something, but what do they do? All right, on to the challenge. All right, so the challenge for this lesson is to see if you can use some of those looping statements to force the user to answer your questions, right? So I showed you in the beginning of this lesson that I had, at the very end of my splash screen stuff, I started asking the player questions. What was their name? What was their house? What was their gender? In the application's current state, the user can just hit the enter key and bypass those questions. But I want you to try to use what you learned here today to restrict that functionality and have the user answer those questions. All right, so that was it for this lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button. If you are not subscribers, please subscribe and make sure you hit that notification bell so you know when I post new videos. Talk to you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.